Why, yes, the train arrives. Actually, it doesn't arrive. Beer Money, a memoir of privilege and loss by Francis Stroh. Got the windows open, it's nice out. Storm is approaching. Let's read. What are we at? Dispossessed. There she is, Franny. Franny Stroh, London, 1996. Grosse Pointe, 1996. My first night back in Michigan, the sky dumped a magical foot of snow, and the morning cast a pale blue light across my room. Hearing my grandmother's voice downstairs in the kitchen, and catching the scent of coffee, I sank back into the pillow, supremely comforted. I'd been awoken I'd been woken by the shrill voice of a neighbor dropping off a present at my mother's door. It's supposed to snow 3 feet before Christmas, the voice had caterwauled. 3 feet. And then gaily closed the door, my grandmother had shouted from the kitchen, silencing the voice. I'm cold. It was my grandmother I had missed most of all during my year and a half abroad, where my parents had fallen short when we were young. My grandmother had always been ready to step in, nurturing us, sometimes even spoiling us. Smiling at her high pitched laughter down in the kitchen, I quickly dressed, brushed my hair, and went down to greet her, taking in the French perfume even from the top of the stairs that always marked her. Joy by Jean Pateau. Passing through the dining room, I could see her sitting at the kitchen table in the next room, regal in her puffed mink hat and mink coat, which she had draped over herself like a blanket. She always complained of the cold in my mother's house. Her wispy white hair had been styled, perhaps just the day before, at the hairdresser she liked here. At 89 years old, her still beautiful face was free of wrinkles, thanks to her daily masks of drugstore cold cream. There's Francis, said my mother with a big smile, as if one of those introducing me on one of those festive afternoon talk shows. Hi, Granny, I said excitedly, bending down to kiss her. My grandmother looked up, her soft brown eyes bright and expectant, but her smile quickly faded. What have you done with your hair? She cried. She turned back to my mother for an explanation. My mother said nothing. It's short, Granny, that's all. I knew she was prone to outbursts of scathing criticism, but thus far I had avoided a target myself. I turned on the kettle for tea, trying to ignore her condemning gaze. But it's just awful, my grandmother said. Look at you. Used to be so beautiful, Franny, and now you're just a plain Jane. The last time she'd seen me, I'd been a long haired golden blonde, it was true. But in London, I had wanted to shed my past, to create myself anew, my hair getting shorter and blonder with each salon visit. I poured the hot water into the mug and dropped in a tea bag. Granny, come on. It's just that you haven't seen me in a while. I've changed. My grandmother brightened. Well, have you met anyone nice over there? I knew what nice meant. Marriageable. At 30, I'd been over the hill in her book for a good 5 years now. I've met a lot of nice people, I said with a smile, dodging the question. I certainly wasn't going to launch into a discourse on the British sensibility of unrequited love. And what about the Fulbright crowd? I'm not going out with any of them, if that's what you mean. She turned to my mother. I just don't understand this at all, my grandmother said. She had the world by the tail. Take it easy, mother, said my mother. Frances is doing all right. All right, I protested. What kind of art does she do anyway? Asked my grandmother. I don't know, mother. Something with video. My own mother didn't know how to describe my art, but I couldn't blame her. I had trouble putting it into layman's terms myself. I left the room carrying my steaming mug of tea with me. Granny, look, I don't expect you to understand my choices, I said from the doorway. But I hope you'll at least try to respect them, okay? I want to understand you, she said. It's just I don't. I went back upstairs to my bedroom and crawled under the covers. Flurries of snow blew outside the frosted windows. My mother had moved to this more modest house when I turned 22, and noise traveled. I could hear them continuing the debate downstairs. My grandmother irate, my mother doing her best to pacify her. My grandmother had always been my greatest fan, spoiling me in a way my mother never had. She was the one who provided the piles of fresh fruit, new winter coats, the trips to the toy store, indulgences my mother generally discouraged. My grandmother's love, it seemed, never wavered. Once I'd started college, she took me on regular shopping trips in New York, even setting me up with a personal shopper at Saks Fifth Avenue. You didn't go to Hudson's and you're from Detroit? We'd go from one department to the next, piling clothes into the personal shopper's arms. I could point to any garment or accessory, and she would carry it back to a private dressing room where all the things would be waiting when I came in. That same night, I'd wear one of my new outfits downtown to have drinks at the Odeon, check out a band at CBGB, and head to an artist's loft party in the Bowery with a gang of friends. The following day, I'd meet my grandmother uptown at the Colony Club for lunch, wearing one of the more conservative dresses she'd bought me. I could serve both worlds comfortably, but lower Manhattan, that was my thing. Promise me you'll never take the subway, my grandmother would say after lunch at the Colony Club, handing me an envelope full of 20s and hailing me a cab on Park Avenue. I wish you wouldn't always insist on staying downtown. My grandmother stubbornly held out hope that I'd fill into the life she imagined for me. Married at 24, say, to a good Upper East Sider, summering in Nantucket or the Vineyard, holding whatever club memberships, maybe even becoming the kind of killer bridge player she was. Now I understood that all the pampering, all the exclusive vacations, and beautiful clothing had been an active attempt to secure this future for me. Clearly, it had not come to pass. In her eyes, then, I had failed. I was single, an artist. I had opted out of the society that was my birthright. Had I become a painter, at least, perhaps the blow might have softened somewhat. A painter was the kind of artist people understood. Renoir, Monet, Picasso, you know. Francis is the next great painter, they would have said at cocktail parties. You aren't so worldly, Francis, my mother sometimes told me, meaning, I think, that I didn't steer my opportunities to any particular outcome. I was a bit of an idealist. I'd always taken this as a compliment, though I was fairly certain it hadn't been meant that way. Whitney and Bobby arrived in the afternoon. Whitney from Palm Beach, his LL Bean duffel bag freshly dusted with Michigan snow, while Bobby was just coming from across town. Bobby had recently become a gross pointer again, having moved from Dallas to work at the brewery headquarters. I'd primped in advance of their arrival, now morbidly self conscious about my appearance, but also excited to see the men in the family to whom the women's attention would now, thankfully, turn. You look every bit the artiste, said Bobby when he saw me. All right, that was more like it. Francis, looking good, said Whitney. Step outside for a smoke. We huddled by the garage door in our sweaters, minimally shielded from the gusting snow. A station wagon crawled along the street and skidded at the stop sign. This Christmas is going to be a fucking joyride, Whitney said with a wicked smile, dragging on his camel. Because of our father and Alyssa's elopement, he meant. We were all going out to Jackson together, a trip my father had clearly planned to get us acquainted with Alyssa. We were leaving the day after Christmas. First, though, we were scheduled to see my father and Alyssa right here in Grosse Pointe the following day. Change is in the air, I told my brother. No kidding. Whitney tossed his cigarette into a snowdrift and rubbed his hands together. As if it weren't bad enough, Mom moving to this grim little house. Whitney and I went inside to find Bobby and my mother talking at the kitchen table. Whitney's loafers squeaked on the kitchen's plasticized tile floor. He smirked in my direction. I knew he missed the old house, its proximity to the forest, where we played as children, our cousins Pierre and Freddie nearby, the familiarity of every curve on the road when he sped his car home after a high school party. I understood. I missed those things too. The old house had been part of the old life, the life we'd lost, bit by bit, after the divorce. Too many memories in this place, my mother had said just before she sold it. At the new house, a 1950s brick box, we might see a neighbor doing gardening work, inflating a baby pool, or firing up a grill. Activities we'd really seen on the provincial road. I don't know how to say that. I still don't know how. I should learn. Where gardeners, cooks, and hired pool cleaners were the norm. But my mother loved that her new neighbors kept an eye on one another's houses, talked to each other over fences, and dropped off tins of cookies at Christmas time. Perhaps she felt less isolated here. It agreed with her, and since Marion Lloyd, who was now in Oregon visiting his son, she seemed to have dropped 10 years from her age. She looked slimmer and happier, though her chronic insomnia over the years had left dark circles under her eyes. Whitney went upstairs to unpack. After his shower, the scent of baby rum or bay rum aftershave flowed in the hallway. My grandmother put extra wool blankets at the ends of our beds and turned up the heat. Charlie, my mother informed us, had gone to Mexico for the holiday. It's for the best, she said flatly, her eyes trained on the pot of Campbell's soup she was warming at the stove. My mother had arranged a meeting for us downtown for the following day with Bill Penner. You need to get the facts, she said. She meant about the financial implications of my father's elopement. Her 30-year settlement agreement with my father would not be disrupted, but my brothers and I had no such binding agreements. You all have to face this. One might have thought from her tone that we were headed for the guillotine. We dressed for the occasion. I in a black and white checked double breasted jacket with black pants and heeled boots. Bobby and Whitney sporting blazers, ties, and gray flannels. We met in the trust department of our family bank in downtown Detroit, an entity designed to keep the family trust management under our own roof. Nearly all the Stroh Brewery Company shares were held in multiple generation skipping trusts for the protection of the company and the family. At least that's how my grandfather, etc., planned it. These trusts kept the brewery assets intact so that subsequent generations of Strohs might continue to own and manage the business while also paying our quarterly distributions to the family shareholders and their spouses. Within our nuclear family, my father was the only shareholder. Bill Penner, an attorney with the big Detroit firm Butzel Long, agonized over a pile of documents at the head of the boardroom table. As we filed in, his skin stretched too tightly over his clearly exhausted face. We looked up with red in the eyes. Thanks for coming down, he said, in a tone that could only be called funereal. I wish it were under better circumstances. We all shook his hand and sat down. Bill had grown gaunt with age. Whitney had once remarked that he looked as if he summered on 3 Mile Island, and I couldn't help but laugh. Now I felt badly. This man seemed so genuinely concerned about the situation we found ourselves in, so determined to do whatever he could to help us. I've been reviewing the trusts that benefit your father, he said soberly as he flipped through a thick document And, well, afraid I don't have very good news. The heir left the room. Bobby wiped his brow and gave me a long, suffering look that said, "Here we go again." As you know, Bill continued, your father and Alyssa did not sign a prenuptial agreement before they wed. That in itself is troubling. The other piece of unfortunate news, though, is this. Two of the four generation skipping trusts that benefit your father give him a power of appointment over the income, meaning that he can, or even from a legal standpoint, may have to, appoint that income to Alyssa after his death. I felt the raw taste of fear at the back of my throat. Whitney leaned back on the rear legs of his chair, his hands white knuckling the edge of the mahogany table. Bobby looked up from his notepad. Let me get this straight, Bill. Our father may have to leave Alyssa his trust assets. I don't understand. That money was made by his father and grandfather. Bill nodded. That's correct. And just to be clear, he may leave only the income from the trust's assets, not the assets themselves. Those, of course, will pass to your children. We had no children, and even if we had, Alyssa would receive the income for the entire span of her lifetime. My brothers and I would be passed over entirely, leading the term generation, lending the term generation skipping trust an unpalatable new twist. Until now, I had never given the trust much thought. I was young, and artists, well, they were always just scraping by, and so I had learned to romanticize my bohemianism, if only to cope with a lifestyle that afforded few of the luxuries I'd enjoyed in the past. In fact, until very recently, I had been perfectly happy on my chosen path, self abnegation included. But now, I realized that the Stroh trusts, psychologically certainly, had always in truth served as something of a safety net for me. I'd never had to cope with serious uncertainty. All that had changed now, and not just because of my father's impetuous behavior. The vast majority of the Stroh Brewery's value had virtually disintegrated while I had been holed up in my art studio in London wrestling with esoteric issues of point of view in my video installation pieces. For several years, every major brewer in the United States had been undercutting its competition with price reductions, and Stroh had been forced to follow suit. With no margins and no cash, our business was tanking. In a desperate last attempt to stay afloat, and with the help of another massive loan, the Stroh Brewery acquired the G. Heilman Brewing Company, a brewery in even direr straits than our own. The marriage was a poor one, and our continued to drop. Yet the Stroh board went on paying the family shareholders the large income to which everyone was accustomed. Indeed, my father's lifestyle seemed to grow more lavish by the minute, with grander houses, fancier boats, and showier cars. His denial was contagious. Even Bobby, Whitney, and I assumed our businesses must be faring better than reported at the annual family business meetings. For years, we'd all flown cross country to attend these meetings, a requirement of all shareholders, present and future, under the assumption that the trusts would be there and that we as further future shareholders, were ultimately responsible for our stake in the company. Now it was clear we'd never had any control over the company's destiny, let alone the trust's. Jesus, this just keeps getting worse, said Bobby as he read the bullet points Bill had placed in front of us. Each of you will have to seriously consider what you will do for income, Bill said, sitting back down. Historically, the brewery has supported the family, but you would not be well advised to consider these trusts as a significant source of future income. It was as if I'd come home to a seared patch of ground where my house had stood. Nor was the problem simply the loss of future income. Suddenly, the notion of being an artist seemed frivolous and misguided. I'd have to find something to apply myself to that guaranteed a decent living. Hell, I didn't even have medical insurance. On some level, certainly, my mother had strived to prepare us for this all our lives, but being actively disinherited, well, this was a rather different thing from having money and pretending as if one didn't. The life I had imagined for myself, becoming a successful artist, owning my own apartment, perhaps even collecting the work of other emerging artists, suddenly it all felt well out of reach. Reading the fear in my brothers' faces, I realized they too must be letting go of certain hopes about their futures. For Whitney, it was an Upper East Side apartment, August's on Long Island, and the ability to leave behind that monthly spike in anxiety triggered by opening his American Express bill. Just the night before, when my mother asked him about his job raising money for a friend's company, he quipped that he'd rather live Unabomber style in the woods of Montana before he did any bootlicking. Now he might just have to. Bobby had hoped one day to be able to leave his job at the brewery and run a restaurant in the Caribbean. But the way things were going at the brewery, he'd likely be leaving before he could afford to. The money had never been ours, of course, and none of us had ever had expectations of being rich. But knowing the Stroh trusts were there had given us the space to dream of the lives we wanted for ourselves. Hold on a second, Bill, I jumped in. Alyssa is not the mother of our father's children. That's got to count for something. No, she's not, Bill said. But you see, when these trusts were written back in the 40s, divorce wasn't common. Your grandfather assumed that lawful wife meant first and only wife. Times and circumstances have obviously changed since then. The documents, however, make no distinction between first and second wives, or even third, for that matter. Whitney shifted restlessly in his chair, his upper lip beating with sweat. Pardon? Bill, are you saying that Alyssa will likely get the biggest piece of the pie? Bill looked at all of us with sympathy. At my urging, your father and Alyssa are currently negotiating a postnuptial agreement, but, well, your father has no leverage. Really, at this point, Alyssa and her attorney have already rejected several generous proposals. So, you three should be advised that Alyssa, now that she's legally married to your father, can pretty much write her own ticket. And you can be sure she will, muttered Bobby. Afraid so, Bill said. I put my pen down on the table and pulled on my coat. Are we finished? I asked. Everyone nodded. Merry fucking Christmas, said Whitney to no one in particular. This will be a short one here, so let's get on with it. I mean, not short, but Christmas, 1974 by Eric Stroh. Assume that's Francis. Not that I'm talking to anyone since no one comes here in the wide view videos. My father's house was brimming with Christmas spirit. We'd come straight from the meeting at the bank, stiff from cold. Handel's Messiah was piped in from hidden speakers in the walls, and a handsome trimmed tree brightened the living room, the floor beneath blanketed with festively wrapped presents. Bah humbug, said my father with a big grin as we sat down. How about some eggnog? Sure, I said. I needed the drink. At least here I could count on more whiskey than nog. Alyssa will be back any minute, said my father cheerfully as he left the room. She's dropping off some presents at her father's house. Is the storm rolling in, finally? It's getting windy. Oh, shit. We got some wind. Bobby, Whitney, and I gave each other meaningful looks. This was the first time we'd all be together as a family, and we had agreed in the car not to let on about the meeting. Bill had told us that my father knew we'd come down and would be calling for the report. And I guessed this was the reason for my father's uncharacteristic cheerfulness. The meeting, after all, had gone off with a hitch. Without a hitch. Damn, that's a nice breeze coming in right now. Beautiful. Whitney suddenly stood up and stamped the snow off his loafers onto the Berber carpet, as if marking his territory before Alyssa returned. Bobby laughed at his younger brother. Nice. Now there's going to be a big puddle in the middle of the goddamn carpet. Dad's going to love that. Better there than on my shoes, Whitney said. But a moment later he picked up the chunks of snow and carried them into the kitchen. My father's benevolent mood, he knew, especially toward him, was as changeable as the wind. Beautiful objects adorned every surface in the room. An antique partner's desk stood in the bay window with a gilt framed painting by Gary Melchers on the adjacent wall. Tasteful patterned fabrics covered the upholstered furniture. Why do I smell? I guess that's not smoke. Tasteful patterned fabrics covered the upholstered furniture. 18th century walnut side tables held needlepoint coasters for drinks. The tree sparkled with old family ornaments and colored lights, just as it does smell like smoke. Guess my smoke alarms would be going off if it was me. The tree sparkled with old family ornaments. Keep smelling smoke. I'm going to check. Make sure there's nothing smoking. Must be coming from outside. The tree sparkled with old family ornaments and colored lights just as it had when we were children. Back in those days before the advent of video, my father would draw the curtains on Christmas Eve day to project 35mm films of all the Christmas classics. A Christmas Carol, It's a Wonderful Life, White Christmas. The living room would be packed with spectators, my parents' friends, their kids, and of course, the four of us. The adults drank Bloody Marys all afternoon, forming a chatty line at the tabletop bar while my father switched reels mid-movie. The next morning, Bing Crosby's White Christmas would be playing on the stereo when we came down to investigate our stockings. Charlie and Bobby would get toothpaste, toothbrushes, deodorant, pens, and a jar of macadamia nuts, contents that left me baffled by Santa's odd sense of practicality. Whitney and I got dime store toys with the price tag still attached, tubes of toothpaste, and packets of pencils. Most years my father slipped into my stocking a Cuban cigar which I'd smoke with him in the late afternoon after the guest had gone home. My father came in with the nog and placed the glass next to me on one of the coasters. Ho ho ho, Merry Christmas. He gave me a goofy smile. How'd you like the tree? Very nice, said Bobby. When did you put it up? Last week before all the snow. I haven't had a real tree in years. For about a decade after the divorce, my father had pretty much given up on everything, even Christmas, making do with a small tabletop tree. He even gave away his entire 35mm film collection, hundreds of rare prints, but in spite of everything, he'd managed to stay away from the bottle. Now, though, along with the tree, he had brought the drinking back into his life. I spotted the small aquamarine Tiffany box under the tree. Who's that little blue box for? I asked pointedly, remembering Christmases past when the Tiffany box had been for me. That's for my sweetie, my father beamed. It took me a moment to register that he meant Alyssa. I glanced around the room and noticed that the family photos were now mixed in with shots of her. I looked over at Bobby, who was trying to suppress a laugh. Whitney came into the room, downing a Pepsi. I like that painting of the pheasants in the kitchen, he said to my father. Where'd you get it? He sat down on the sofa, nervously crunching the half empty Pepsi can. Out in Jackson, said my father, putting another log on the fire, at a wildlife art gallery. Whitney put the Pepsi can down on the coaster. Outstanding. Maybe we can go there next week, see what else they've got. Rising from the fireplace, my father gave Whitney a disingenuous smile. Trouble with you, Whit, is you've got champagne tastes on a beer budget. This was his favorite line. Whitney looked as if he'd just been slapped. Coming on the heels of our visits to Bill Penner, my father's gloating seemed almost sinister. The three of us could put on a good face for only so long. Just then the wreathed front door opened with a rattle, registering somewhere between festive and frantic. Hello, Alyssa's voice called from the front hall as a gust of freezing wind brought the temperature in the house down several degrees all at once. Close the damn door, Alyssa, shouted my father. Then come on into the living room. We're in here. The door slammed shut, and a moment later Alyssa came in, ruddy faced and wild eyed, her glance shifting self consciously from face to face. Look, everyone's here, she burst out, giving me a big breasted hug before turning to shake hands with Bobby and Whitney, who stood up to receive her. She wore lumberjack boots and an oversized down jacket that she absently tossed onto the rug. How are things on the other side of the pond? She said, turning back to me. Not bad, I smiled, pretending, as she was, to be comradely. It was going to be a long week out in Jackson, I realized. Hey, have the police found out who burgled you? Before I could even answer, Alyssa roared with laughter at her own quip, while my father gazed at her admiringly. The burglary had happened while she and my father were in London, making it an easy conversation topic over several dinners. She'd asked me this same question and laughed in the same way a couple of times before. Not yet, I sipped my eggnog. But you know, they're searching high and low. We turned the corner onto Lakeland Road, the snowplow just ahead of us, spewing salt and snow in all directions. Every door on the street was wreathed. Some had Christmas lights strung across the shrubs or fixed around doorway arches that were coming on in fading light. When we were younger, back on Provincial Road, my mother would drive us to other parts of Grosse Pointe to see the showier displays of Christmas lights and lawn decorations, usually at the new money houses along Lakeshore Drive. I hate this house, said Whitney bitterly as we pulled into my mother's driveway. His palpable anger needed somewhere to land. I made no effort to connect or appease him. You could always stay at Dad's house, Bobby answered, deadpan, as he parked the car with your lovely stepmother. For a few moments, we just sat there in the rental car. A bright red Ford Probe, the windshield wipers scraping loudly over the ice that had frozen to the glass. The house looked gloomy, all the rooms dark except for the library, where I knew my mother sat reading. She had no Christmas lights outside, and the lights on the tree in the living room hadn't yet been turned on. She'd never gone in for frills. When we were kids, on an excursion to buy Whitney a fishing rod, my mother had told him adamantly, nothing fancy, just a stick and a string. No one made a move to get out of the car. We haven't talked about everything that just happened, I said tentatively. Bobby turned off the car, and the wipers stopped mid scrape. He jingled the keys. Yeah, didn't want to be the one to start that conversation. I'll say it. Oh, oh, shit. Whitney interrupted him. What a fucking turd fest. I mean, did you even see Alyssa bring Dad that cocktail as we were leaving? She's up to a lot more than getting the money. She's trying to fucking kill the poor bastard. I shared his alarm, although I knew the drink wasn't Alyssa's fault. Nora was hastening my father's demise the same as causing it, though it felt good for the moment to have a scapegoat. From where we sat, it seemed we'd lost both our father and his legacy, and Elisa was an easy target. I'd often wondered if having money was more of a curse than an asset, and at that moment, money and death seemed hopelessly intertwined. Guess Dad and Charlie are in a race to die first, I said, and Alyssa's certainly getting all her ducks. Your father married bar scum, Francis, said Whitney. Get used to it. Our family is like a Vanity Fair story on steroids. Bobby and I laughed at the absurdity of this, but I felt gutted at the thought of my father drinking regularly again with Alyssa, and after everything our family had been through, his getting drunk and eloping without a prenup seemed supremely selfish. It's just very sad, that's all, said Bobby. He leaned back into the driver's seat with a sigh of defeat. You're lucky you both live so far away. Watching this up close, it's going to be torture. I exhaled two steady streams of smoke through my nostrils. Believe me, I'd get on a plane back to London in a heartbeat if I could. Things had taken a turn for the worse in London, but anything was better than this. As I watched my brothers, I wondered how they would cope. Bobby gazed out the car window at the freshly falling snow, his expression one of resignation. Whitney sat smoking in the back seat, his face stamped with bitterness. Wondering where I would go, what I would do, I suddenly felt the deepest fatigue, the kind no amount of sleep might relieve. Night had fallen. Still, we did not get out of the parked car. Soft clumps of snow floated down into the beams of the street lamps behind us, and every house on the street, with the exception of ours, shimmered with festive lights. I could hear the faint sound of singing and turned to see a neighbor's front door open and a group of carolers standing inside their warmly lit atrium. Hark, the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn king. They sang joyously to the crowd gathered around them in the cold, cold night. The sugary smell of Campbell's tomato soup filled the house as we went in at last. Bob's feeling a headache coming on. My room still felt unfamiliar despite all the years of visiting mother at this house. My old bookshelves, dresser, and desk arranged gracelessly against the polka dotted walls. Get the fuck over there, curtain. Probably by the movers themselves when she first arrived here, never to be revisited. I could hear Bobby's and Whitney's voices down in the kitchen, filling my mother and grandmother in on the meeting with Bill. I couldn't hear the words, but compared with the rise and fall of my brother's distress, my mother's voice was a low murmur. I went into the bathroom, took two Advil, and looked in the mirror. There were swollen sacs beneath my eyes. My skin was pale with winter, translucent almost. My grandmother was right. My hair looked like hell, bleached and cut too short. A super crop bob that succeeded only in rendering me utterly androgynous. I had even taken to slicking it back in the style of a man. The cut and color had looked chic in my mirror in England, but here, in my mirror back home, I could see only that I'd thrown away my looks and 2 years of my life to chase down a dream that now seemed as elusive as Santa Claus. An American woman, the next British art star, I laughed bitterly, wanting to scream for all the wasted time, the squandered energy, the crazy hubris that had kept that dream alive. I grabbed my cheap hair and pulled until the tears came. Alright, that's fucking. How many pages is this next chapter? Don't think I'm gonna get into this too long. too fucking... Yeah, that's way too long. I'll die before I can read that. Alright, that's going to be all. All nobodies that came. The end.